the Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching at its peak from the Pacific coast of China to the gates of Eastern Europe. But the men who built and ruled it rarely died the way conquerors are supposed to. Not on battlefields, not by the sword. They died from carpets, from hangovers, from gold pressed onto them by the men who just conquered them. This is how the rulers of half the known world actually met their end. Ancient Mongolia, 1206. A man named Temujin had just finished a war that killed most of his own relatives to win it. He was crowned Genghis Khan, ruler of a newly unified Mongol nation, and one of the first things he did afterward was decide what to do with his oldest friend. Jamukha had known Temujin since childhood. The two boys swore an oath of blood brotherhood on the steppe, exchanging gifts and vows that were supposed to bind them for life. Instead, Jamukha spent 2 decades as his greatest rival, leading coalition after coalition against him, losing every time. In 1206, Jamukha's own men turned on him and delivered him to Genghis Khan in chains. Expecting a reward, Genghis Khan had the men who betrayed Jamukha executed on the spot, refusing to reward disloyalty even when it worked in his favor. Then he turned to his old friend and offered him something rare among steppe rivals: reconciliation, a place beside him, a second chance at the brotherhood they had sworn as boys. Jamukha refused the offer. According to the secret history of the Mongols, he told Genghis Khan that 2 sons could not share one sky, and that keeping him alive would only weaken the empire his friend had just finished building. He asked instead for a death without spilled blood, the traditional mark of respect reserved for Mongol nobility, and Genghis Khan granted it. Accounts describe his spine broken, his body left whole. No blade touched him. Loyalty killed Jamukha more efficiently than betrayal ever had. Persia, 1220. Genghis Khan's armies turned toward the Khwarezmian Empire, at the time the largest Muslim state on earth, ruled by a man who called himself the Second Alexander. Shah Muhammad II had an army several times the size of the force riding against him. It made no difference. City after city fell in weeks, not years. Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench. The Shah's own commanders scattered rather than face the Mongols in open battle, and Muhammad fled east with a shrinking handful of followers, hunted across his own empire by cavalry he could not outrun. He died in December of that year, on a small island in the Caspian Sea, with almost nothing left. Chroniclers writing decades later describe a ruler too poor by the end to be buried in a proper shroud, wrapped instead in a servant's own shirt, his empire gone before his body was cold. The man who minted coins declaring himself the shadow of God on earth was buried in another man's clothes. Mongolia, August of 1227. Genghis Khan himself was dying, and almost nobody around him wanted to admit it. He was near 70 years old, still commanding a siege against the Tangut kingdom of western Shah, when his health collapsed weeks after a fall from his horse during a hunt. The precise cause was never settled, and it still isn't. Court chronicles blend a hunting injury with unspecified illness. A persistent folk legend, unverified by any contemporary source, claims a captured Tangut princess wounded him fatally on their wedding night rather than submit to him. Other, more clinically minded chroniclers describe simply a fever that never broke, plausible enough for a man nearing 70, who had spent decades sleeping in open camps across one of the harshest climates on Earth. What's certain is that he died before the Tangut capital fell, and that his commanders decided the empire could not afford to know it yet. His death was kept secret for weeks while the campaign finished. When the funeral procession finally moved his body home across the steppe, the men escorting it killed everyone they encountered along the route, travelers and herders alike, so that no one could report where the greatest conqueror in history had gone to be buried. The soldiers who dug his grave were killed afterward by a second group of guards. Those guards, in turn, were killed by a third. Nobody left the mountain alive who knew where he was. To this day, no expedition has ever confirmed the location of Genghis Khan's grave. Mongolia, 1232. Genghis Khan's chosen successor, his son Ögedei, was only a year into a brutal campaign against the Jin dynasty when he collapsed in his camp, gripped by a violent illness no physician there could name or treat. Court shamans were brought in to explain it, and according to the secret history of the Mongols, their divination pointed to spirits of the land demanding a life from within Genghis Khan's own bloodline in exchange for Ögedei's. Ögedei's younger brother Tolui, commander of the empire's core army and a war hero in his own right, volunteered without hesitation. Tolui drank a potion prepared by the shamans, reportedly declaring aloud that he was taking his brother's sickness into his own body. Within days, he sickened. Ögedei's fever broke and he recovered fully. Tolui did not, and died shortly after at around 40 years old, leaving 4 sons who would each go on to rule pieces of the empire he gave up for his brother. Ögedei lived 9 more years on borrowed time, ruling an empire his brother had quietly paid for with his own life. Karakorum, December of 1241. Genghis Khan's third son, Ögedei, had inherited the title of Great Khan and, with it, a habit his father never had to manage. Ögedei drank constantly, and everyone around him knew it was killing him. His ministers had tried limiting him to a fixed number of cups per day, and Ögedei responded by ordering a single larger cup made to fit inside the new rule, technically obeying his own physicians while drinking exactly as much as before. He was 56 years old, freshly returned from a hunting trip through the mountains near Karakorum, when he sat down for a night of heavy drinking with his brother-in-law and did not wake up the next morning. No battle, no assassin, no war wound. Just a body that had been given every chance to slow down and chose not to take any of them. The empire that had conquered from the Pacific coast to the gates of Vienna lost its ruler to a hangover he never recovered from. Mongolia, 1248. The succession crisis that followed Ögedei's death took years to resolve, and it produced Güyük Khan, whose reign lasted barely 2. Güyük became Great Khan in 1246, already in poor health, and by the spring of 1248 he was riding west at the head of an army, officially to inspect the empire's western territories. Almost every historian who has studied the campaign agrees on what it was actually for. Güyük's cousin Batu, ruler of the Golden Horde, had refused to attend his coronation and openly defied his authority, and the march west carried every sign of a Khan riding to remove a rival by force. He never reached him. Güyük died suddenly during the journey, near Karakoço, in April of 1248, not yet 40 years old. Chronicles blame his weakened health and years of drinking, the same habit that had already killed his father. Later rumors, never proven, claimed poison arranged by Batu's allies, who had every motive and, conveniently, an army camped close enough to have done it. Either way, the confrontation he had spent months preparing for ended without a single arrow loosed, and the throne he left behind stayed empty for 3 years while his relatives fought over who deserved it. China, August of 1259. Möngke Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, personally led an invasion into Song territory and laid siege to the mountain fortress of Diaoyu in Sichuan, a stronghold that had already held out against Mongol forces for months. Möngke never took it. He died at the siege on August 11th, and even now historians disagree about how. The account accepted by most modern scholars points to dysentery or cholera tearing through the Mongol camp in the summer heat, a common and unglamorous killer in any prolonged siege far from home, in unfamiliar terrain. Drinking water the army had no way to properly secure. A separate, more dramatic legend, popular for centuries in Chinese sources, claims he was struck by a stone hurled from a Song trebuchet during an assault on the walls, and some later writers combined both versions, suggesting a wound that later turned septic in the summer heat. Either way, the fortress that resisted the largest army in the world may have been undone less by its walls than by its water supply. News of his death took months to reach the rest of the empire, and by the time it did, the invasion of Song China he had personally commanded simply stopped, its army withdrawn without ever breaking Diaoyu's walls. The fortress that could not be taken by force outlasted the Khan who came to take it. Möngke's death forced his brothers to abandon campaigns on 3 separate fronts to race home and fight over his throne, a war that fractured the empire permanently into competing khanates. One of those brothers, Hulagu, was already deep into a campaign of his own, and its final act became one of the strangest executions the Mongols ever carried out. Baghdad, February of 1258. The city had served as the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate for over 500 years, when Hulagu Khan's army broke through its walls and captured the last reigning caliph, al-Mustasim. Accounts describe Hulagu ordering the caliph's treasury opened before him, revealing gold and silver the caliph had hoarded rather than spent on the soldiers who might have defended the city. Hulagu is said to have placed a plate of that gold in front of him and told him to eat it. Since he had valued it more than the men who could have saved him, the execution that followed avoided bloodshed on purpose. Mongol custom held that royal blood should never touch the ground, so instead of the sword, the caliph was rolled inside a carpet and trampled to death by horsemen, his body crushed without a single visible wound. Mongol tradition spared his blood. It did not spare him. The city itself fared no better than its caliph. Hulagu's forces spent roughly a week sacking Baghdad, a city that had stood for 5 centuries as one of the intellectual centers of the medieval world, and estimates of the dead recorded by contemporary and near-contemporary chroniclers range from the tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands. The House of Wisdom, one of the great libraries of the medieval world, burned along with its contents, and later accounts claimed the Tigris ran dark with ink washed from its books, or red with blood, depending on which chronicler told the story. Across 8 deaths and more than 50 years, almost none of the men who built the Mongol Empire died the way their enemies expected. Not in open battle, not by an opposing blade meeting theirs in single combat. A hangover ended one reign, a carpet ended another. A brother's borrowed sickness bought 9 extra years for a third. Poverty and a stolen shirt buried an emperor who once called himself the Shadow of God. The Mongols built an empire on terror, discipline, and a level of battlefield coordination no army on earth could match at the time. None of that determined how their own rulers actually left the world. And the man who started it all, who conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome managed in 4 centuries, was buried so carefully and so violently that his own empire could never find him again.